our many lost values, there's one more. The high worth of those people who spoke and wrote Russian before us. It is odd that they are almost undescribed in our pre-revolutionary literature. Only very rarely do we feel their breath. From Marina Tsvetaeva or from Mother Maria in her recollections of Bloch. They saw too much to settle on any one thing. They reached toward the sublime too fervently to stand firmly on the earth. Before society's falls, just such a stratum of wise, thinking people emerges, people who are that and nothing more. And how they were laughed at, how they were mocked, as though they stuck in the craw of people whose deeds and actions were single-minded and narrow-minded. And the only nickname they were christened with was rot, because these people were a flower that bloomed too soon and breathed too delicate a fragrance, and so they were mowed down. These people were particularly helpless in their personal lives. They could neither bend with the wind, nor pretend, nor get by. Every word declared as an opinion, a passion, a protest, and it was just such people the mowing machine cut down, just such people the chaff cutters shredded. They had passed through these very same cells, but the cell walls for the wallpaper had long since been stripped off, and they had been plastered, whitewashed, and painted more than once, gave off nothing of the past. On the contrary, the walls now tried to listen to us with hidden microphones. Nowhere is anything written down or reported of the former inhabitants of these cells, of the conversations held in them, of the thoughts which earlier inmates went forth to be shot or to imprisonment in the Solovetsky Islands, and now such a volume, which should be worth 40 freight car loads of our literature, will in all probability never be written. Those still alive recount to us all sorts of trivial details. That there used to be wooden trestle beds in here, and that mattresses were stuffed with straw. That way back in 1920, before they put muzzles over the windows, the panes were whitewashed up to the top. By 1923, muzzles had been installed, although we unanimously ascribed them to Beria. They said that back in the 20s, prison authorities had been very lenient towards prisoners communicating with each other by knocking on the walls. This was a carryover from the stupid tradition in the Tsarist prisons that if the prisoners were deprived of knocking, they would have no way to occupy their time. And another thing, back in the 20s, all the jailers were Latvians, from the Latvian Red Army units and others, and the food was all handed out by strapping Latvian women. All this was trivial detail, but it was certainly food for thought. I myself had needed very badly to get into this main Soviet political prison, and I was grateful that I had been sent here. I thought about Bukharin a great deal, and I wanted to picture the whole thing as it had actually been. However, I had the impression that we were now merely the remnants, and that in this respect we might just as well have been in any provincial internal prison. Still, there was a good deal of status in being here, and there was no reason to be bored with my companions in my new cell. They were people to listen to and people with whom to compare stories. The old fellow with the lively eyebrows, at 63 he had no way bore himself like an old man, was Anatoly Ilyich Festenko. He was a big asset to our Lubyanka cell, both as a keeper of the old Russian prison traditions and as a living history of Russian revolutions. Thanks to all that he remembered, he somehow managed to put it in perspective, everything that had taken place in the past and everything that was taking place in the present. Such people are valuable not only in a cell. We hardly need them in our society as a whole. We badly need them in our society as a whole. Right there in our cell, we read Festenko's name in a book about the 1905 revolution. He had been a social democrat for such a long, long time that in the end it seemed he had ceased to be one. He had been sentenced to his first prison term in 1904 when he was still a young man, but he had been freed outright under the manifesto proclaimed on October 17, 1905. His story about amnesty was interesting. In those years, of course, there were no muzzles on the prison windows, and from the cells of the Ch.5 prison in which Pastenko was being held, the prisoners could easily observe the prison courtyard and the street, and all arrivals and departures, and they could shout back and forth as they pleased to ordinary citizens outside. During the day of October 17th, these outsiders, having learned of the amnesty by telegraph, announced the news to the prisoners. In their happiness, the political prisoners went wild with joy. They smashed window panes, broke down doors, and demanded that the prison warden release them immediately. And were any of them kicked right in the snout with jackboots, or put in punishment cells, or was anyone deprived of library or commissary privileges? Of course not. In his distress, the warden ran from cell to cell and implored them, "Gentlemen, I beg of you, please be reasonable. I don't have the authority to release you on the basis of a telegraph report. I must have direct orders from my superiors in Kiev. Please, I beg of you. You will have to spend the night here." And in actual fact, they were most barbarously kept there one more day. On getting back their freedom, Pastenko and his comrades immediately rushed to join the revolution. In 1906, he was sentenced to 8 years at hard labor, which meant 4 years in irons and 4 in exile. He served the first 4 in the Sebastopol Central Prison, where, incidentally, during his stay, a mass escape was organized from outside by a coalition of revolutionary parties, the SRs, the anarchists, and the Social Democrats. A bomb blew a hole in the prison wall big enough for a horse and rider to go through, and 24 prisoners, not everyone who wanted to escape, but those who had been chosen ahead of time by their parties and right inside the prison, had been equipped with pistols by the jailers, fled through the hole and escaped. All but one, Anatoly Pastenko, was selected by the Russian Social Democrat Party not to escape, but to cause a disturbance in order to distract the attention of the guards. On the other hand, when he reached exile in the Iine area, he did not stay long, comparing his stories, and later those of others who had survived, with the well-known fact that under the Tsar, our revolutionaries escaped from exile by the hundreds and hundreds, and more of them went abroad. One comes to the conclusion that the only prisoners who did not escape from Tsarist exile were the lazy ones, because it was so easy. Pastenko escaped, which is to say he simply left his place of exile without a passport. He went to Vladivostok, expecting to get aboard a steamer through an acquaintance there. Somehow it did not work out. So then, still without a passport, he calmly crossed the whole of Mother Russia on a train and went to Ukraine, where he had been a member of the Bolshevik underground and where he had first been arrested. There he was given a false passport, and he left across the Austrian border. That particular step was so routine, and Pastenko felt himself so safe from pursuit that he was guilty of an astonishing piece of carelessness. Having arrived at the border and having turned in his passport to the official there, he suddenly discovered he could not remember his new name. What was he to do? There were 40 passengers altogether, and the officials had already begun to call their names. Pastenko thought up a solution. He pretended to be asleep. He listened as the passports were handed back to their owners, and he noted the name. Markov was called several times without anyone responding. But even at this point, he was not absolutely certain it was his name. Finally, the dragon of the imperial regime bent down to the underground revolutionary, politely tapped him on the shoulder. Mr. Markov, please, here's your passport." Pastenko headed for Paris. There he got to know Lenin and Lunacharsky, and carried out some administrative duties at the party school in Longjumeau. At the same time, he studied French, looked around him, and decided that he wanted to travel farther and see the world. Before the war, he went to Canada, where he worked for a while. He spent some time in the United States as well. He was astonished by the free and easy, yet solidly established life in these countries, and he concluded that they would never have a proletarian revolution, and even that they hardly needed one. Then in Russia, the long-awaited revolution came sooner than expected, and everyone went back to Russia. And then there was one more revolution. Fastenko no longer felt his former passion for these revolutions, but he returned compelled by the same need that urges birds to their annual migrations. There was as much about Fastenko as I could. There was much about Fastenko I could not yet understand. In my eyes, perhaps the main thing about him, and the most surprising, was that he had known Lenin personally, yet he was quite cool in recalling this. Such was my attitude at the time that someone in the cell called Fastenko by his patronymic alone, without using his given name, in other words, simply Ilyich, asking, "Ilyich, is it your turn to take out the latrine bucket?" I was utterly outraged and offended because it seemed sacrilege to me not only to use Lenin's patronymic in the same sentence as latrine bucket, but even to call anyone on earth Ilyich except for one man, Lenin. For this reason, no doubt, there was much that Fastenko would have liked to explain to me that he still could not bring himself to. Nonetheless, he did say to me in the clearest Russian, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," but I failed to understand him. Observing my enthusiasm, he more than once said to me insistently, "You're a mathematician. It's a mistake for you to forget the maxim of Descartes. Question everything, question everything." What did this mean, everything? Certainly not everything. It seemed to me that I had questioned enough things as it was, and that was enough of that. Or, he said, hardly any of the old hard labor political prisoners of Tsar's times are left. I am one of the last. All the hard labor politicals have been destroyed, and they even dissolved our society in the 30s. Why, I asked? So we would not get together and discuss things. And although these simple words, spoken in a calm tone, should have been shouted to the heavens, should have shattered window panes, I understood them only as indicating one more of Stalin's evil deeds. It was a troublesome fact, but without roots. One thing is absolutely definite. Not everything that enters our ears penetrates our consciousness. Anything too far out of tune with our attitude is lost, either in the ears themselves or somewhere beyond, but it is lost. And even though I clearly remember Fastenko's many stories, I recall his opinions but vaguely. He gave me the names of various books which he strongly advised me to read whenever I got back to freedom. In view of his age and his health, he evidently did not count on getting out of prison alive, and he got some satisfaction from hoping that I would someday understand his ideas. I couldn't write down the list of books he suggested, and even as it was, there was a great deal of prison life for me to remember. But I at least remembered those titles which were closest to my taste then. Untimely Thoughts by Gorky, whom I regarded very highly at the time, since he, after all, outdone all the other classical Russian writers in being proletarian, and Plekhanov's A Year in the Motherland. Today, when I read what Plekhanov wrote on October 28, 1917, I can clearly reconstruct what Fastenko himself thought. I am disappointed by the events of the last days, not because I do not desire the triumph of the working class in Russia, but precisely because I pray for it with all the strength of my soul. We must remember Engel's remark that there can be no greater historical tragedy for the working class than to seize political power when it is not ready for it. Such a seizure of power would compel it to retreat far back from the positions which were won in February and March of the present year. When Fastenko returned to Russia, pressure was put on him out of respect for his old underground exploits, to accept him as an important position. But he did not want to. Instead, he accepted a modest post on the newspaper Pravda, and then still more modest one, and eventually he moved over to the Moscow City Planning Office, where he worked in an inconspicuous job. I was surprised. Why had he chosen such a cul-de-sac? He explained in terms I found incomprehensible. You can't teach an old dog to live on a chain. Realizing that there was nothing he could accomplish, Festego was quite simply wanted, in a very human way, to stay alive. He had already gotten used to living on a very small pension, not one of the personal pensions, especially assigned by the government, because to have accepted that sort of thing would have called attention to his close ties to many who had been shot, and he might have survived. He might have managed to survive in this way until 1953, but to his misfortune they arrested another tenant in his apartment, a debauched, perpetually drunk writer, L.S., who had bragged somewhere while he was drunk about owning a pistol. Owning a pistol meant an obligatory conviction for terrorism, and Festego, with his ancient social democratic past, was naturally the very picture of a terrorist. Therefore, the interrogator immediately proceeded to nail him for terrorism and simultaneously, of course, for service in the French and Canadian intelligence services, and thus for service in the Tsarist Ukraine as well. And in 1945, to earn his fat pay, the fat interrogator was quite seriously leafing through the archives of the Tsarist provincial gendarmerie administrations and composing entirely serious interrogation depositions about conspiratorial nicknames, passwords, and secret rendezvous and meetings in 1903. On the 10th day, which was as soon as it was permitted, his old wife, they had no children, delivered to Anatoly Ilyich such parcels as she could manage to put together. A piece of black bread weighing about 10.5 ounces. After all, it had been bought in the open market, where bread cost 50 rubles a pound, and a dozen peeled boiled potatoes, which had been pieced by an awl when the parcel was being inspected. And the sight of those wretched and truly sacred parcels tore at one's heartstrings. That was what this human being had earned for 63 years of honesty and doubts.